Hi, everybody. In this next video, we are going to take a look at our second class of larger biomolecules, a type of molecule called lipids. In order to, and we see several different depictions of lipids here, sort of looking at what they would look like at the structural or molecular level, and then looking at what they would look like sort of as large molecules. And then a good example of where we find lipids. You may remember, again, back to your sort of basic biology, the lipid bilayer in cells. Well, these are lipids. These are the components of that lipid bilayer that we're going to talk about. And we can see that here. This would be a cell membrane right here composed of lipids. So in order to really start to discuss lipids, we have to first talk about what we call fatty acids. Fatty acids are long, straight-chain hydrocarbons that have a carboxylic acid at one end. So we're starting to see now, just like we saw a little bit in the carbohydrates, why we have to discuss some of those organic functional groups that we talked about last week. It's because we're starting to see them now in these larger molecules. Lipids are characterized, or fatty acids are characterized by having this carboxylic acid group. Fatty acids contain an even number of carbons, so there's a long chain hydrocarbon, and that will be an even number of carbons. They're also characterized by their level of saturation. Remember that a saturated hydrocarbon is one that has the maximum number of hydrogens for the number of carbons that are in the chain, meaning that there would not be any double bonds. And so when we start to talk about these long chains, a fatty acid is one of the ways that they're characterized is, does that long chain have any double bonds in it? If so, how many double bonds, where are they, and are those double bonds cis or trans? Trans fatty acids might be something that sounds familiar to you. And we see several different examples of them here. The common name of some, and some of these might sound familiar to you depending on your background, but miracidic fatty acid has 14 carbon atoms, no double bond, so that's a fully saturated fatty acid. And it's something that we find in nutmeg. Palmitic acid, which is one of the primary components of palm oil, for instance, 16 carbons long, no double bonds in there. Stearic acid, one of the components we find in animal fats, 18 carbons long, 0 double bonds, and so forth. And so we see several here, and we'll talk about a couple of these a little later on, things that these are our omega-3 acids, and we'll talk about that terminology. But just several different examples, and we're also going to see as we go on why these melting points are different. And so think about some of the things that we've talked about through the course already, things like dispersion forces and what will increase or decrease dispersion forces. So we can see, for instance, that among our saturated fatty acids here, so there are no double bonds here, so these are all saturated. We can see that our melting point increases as the size of our carbon chain increases, and that's something that we've talked about. And we can see that melting points start to decrease the more unsaturation we add into it. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more and the effects that might have. And so saturated acids, as I mentioned, contain no double bonds. And so here would be an example of one. So here's stearic acid. Mono unsaturated fatty acids contain one double bond. And so here's oleic acid with our one double bond here. And we can see that this is is a cis double bond, which really creates that little bend in the molecule, as opposed to oleic acid, and I might be pronouncing that wrong, I'm not sure, but also just one double bond, but it's a trans double bond, and so we don't get as big of a kink in there. And we can see the effect that has on the melting point. And so the melting point of this is 13 degrees C, so it's going to be a liquid at room temperature, versus a trans fatty acid here, same length, same basic structure, except for this being a trans double bond here, which leads to a flatter molecule, leads to a higher melting point because it's able to have more surface area for those dispersion forces to act on. And so the saturation level and what type of bond we have in a fatty acid will determine the shape and its properties. And again, we're gonna see where that comes into play in a little bit as well. Linoleic acids, or sorry, yeah, linoleic. Oh, sorry, and linolenic. Those are fatty acids that can't be synthesized by the body. When you hear the term essential fatty acids, these are two fatty acids that we must take in somehow through our diet because our body doesn't make them. Omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, and those are maybe something that you've heard of. Omega-3 fatty acids, that's why fish is important. Omega-3 fatty acids are important for heart health. It's one of the reasons why fish is so good for us. It's a source of our omega-3 fatty acids. And so that brings us to talking about a couple of different naming systems that we use when we're talking about fatty acids. The naming systems don't actually have anything to do with how long the carbon chain is. It's all about where are the double bonds. And so nutritional scientists use what we call the omega system, where the numbering will begin at the end of the hydrocarbon chain. So here's linoleic acid here. And so the omega system is going to start our numbering here in green. And we start here for the first carbon, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we come to our double bond, making this an omega-6 fatty acid. As opposed to chemists, use the delta system, where the numbering begins at the carbonyl carbon. And so starts here at our carboxylic acid. And the delta system defines where all of the double bonds are, whereas the omega system only defines where the first one can be found. We can see that even stronger here, or just a more clear example of that. And so linoleic acid, the omega system, again, we start from the end of our carbon chain, the non-carbonyl end. And so this would make this omega-6 fatty acid, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's where our first double bond is. Using the delta system, this would be a delta 9-12 acid. Starting here at our carbonyl carbon, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then linolenic acid is an omega-3 fatty acid using that convention. We start here at the end of our carbon chain. 1, 2, 3 is our first double bond. Or it would be delta 9-12, 15. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So a couple different naming conventions here that we have to be aware of. Triglycerides, commonly called fats, are the most common type of lipid that's obtained through our diet. Triglycerides end up being metabolized in muscle and liver cells and then stored in what we call adipocytes, which are fat cells. Triglycerides are named for their structure. There are 3 fatty acids right here, which go through an esterification reaction, those organic reactions that we looked at. They go through an esterification reaction and then end up being attached to this glycerol backbone. And so we see our glycerol here with its OHs. We have our esterification reaction that then creates an ester right here between the alcohol and the carboxylic acid. And so we can see that forming here. And so this is a nice sort of overall general depiction of what a triglyceride would look like. Here's our glycerol backbone with our 3 fatty acids hanging off that. Triglycerides in general, or triglycerides that are derived from saturated fatty acids, tend to be solid at room temperature. And those are commonly called your general fats. And so when you hear the term saturated fat, for instance, this is what we're talking about, is we're talking about a structure that looks like this, but these fatty acids are all saturated fatty acids, or all saturated, they're all saturated fatty acids. Again, that makes that stacking more prevalent, easier to stack, Higher dispersion forces leads to higher melting points, which, whoa, here we go, which means that most of these are your solids at room temperature, as opposed to triglycerides, which are derived from unsaturated fatty acids. So now we end up with some kinks in our fatty acid chains there, leads to fewer dispersion forces, these tend to be liquids at room temperature, and these would be commonly called oils. Here's your difference between bacon fat, bacon grease, lard, something like that. Those are going to tend to be saturated fatty acids, versus your various olive oil, vegetable oil, and so forth. Those are still triglycerides, but they're going to be made up of more unsaturated fatty acid chains in there, so they'll be liquids at room temperature. That's why it is healthier to cook with olive oil than it is with bacon grease, unfortunately. When fats in general are digested, triglycerides provide for long-term energy storage in our body. Whereas glycogen, which we talked about a little bit with carbohydrates, those are short-term energy stores. Glycogen stores would typically last about a day, whereas triglyceride stores last several weeks. And that's it's one of the things that leads to fat buildup in our body. If we're eating too much, then our body says, okay, we have to store this energy somehow, stores it as triglycerides, stores it as fat cells. Fatty acid catabolism, or fatty acid just sort of processing in general, is the central energy producing pathway for most cells. Provides about 80% of the energy, for instance, for heart and liver cells. Triglycerides provide more than double the energy that carbohydrates and proteins do. And so when we're thinking energy, triglycerides in general, very, very high energy storage. Fats will provide about 9 calories per gram versus about 4 calories per gram for carbohydrates and proteins. So much higher energy content for the mass in triglycerides. Other types of lipids are those that compose cell membranes. Cell membranes are made up primarily of what we call phospholipids and glycolipids, with some cholesterol in there, which we'll talk about later in the lecture, which adds some rigidity. These molecules are what we call amphipathic. They have both polar and nonpolar ends. Membrane lipids contain either a glycerol or a sphingosine backbone, and we'll talk about what that is. When sphingosine is the backbone, one of the hydrocarbon tails in the fatty acid comes from the sphingosine itself. And so here's a sphingosine, and we can see that due to its shape and due to the double bond in there, we get this little kink in it. And so here's our lipid, and we can see these tails, but one of those tails comes from the backbone of the molecule itself. So as opposed to glycerol, we get this bend in there, and so one of our tails comes from the sphingosine. Phospholipids are the most common type of membrane lipid, and they're characterized by a polar phosphate group. This phosphate group then gets linked on to the terminal alcohol group, the hydroxyl group, of either the glycerol or the sphingosine. And we'll see some diagrams of this. And these are just some terminology, some definitions to know, that if we have a phospholipid, which is derived from glycerol, that's called the glycerophospholipid. A phospholipid derived from sphingosine, and I never know if I'm pronouncing that right, is a sphingophospholipid. Sphingophospholipids are also known as sphingomyelins. These are what insulate nerve fibers to create the myelin sheath. If you've studied any neurology at all, any brain chemistry, any nerve, looking at nerves at all, nerve fibers in general are protected by what we call a myelin sheath, and that comes from these sphingomyelins. The phosphate group that's on phospholipids, as I mentioned, is either bound to a glycerol or a sphingosine, and also to a small amino alcohol. And so we can see, And so we can see an amino alcohol right here and a couple different examples. Let's just look at a picture. And so this would be a very typical membrane lipid here. So we might have and this would be a glycolipid because it's formed from a glycerol backbone. And so here's our glycerol backbone right here. We've got a couple of our fatty acids that tail off, a couple of esterification reactions that happen here to attach our to attach our fatty acid onto our glycerol backbone. And then we also have this phosphate group. Remember phosphate, our polyatomic ions going way back to a few weeks ago now. Phosphate, PO4. And so phosphate ends up being attached to our glycerol backbone as well. And then to that is attached this amino alcohol group. And so this would be a very common type of membrane lipid that we might see. All glycolipids that are found in human cells are derived from sphingosine. And so as a result, they end up being called glycosphingolipids. Instead of a phosphate group, these glycolipids have a carbohydrate in between the anomeric carbon. So remember the anomeric carbons that we talked about with carbohydrates, and that terminal hydroxyl group of the sphingosine. So we can see a picture of that here. And so here is an example for us of a glycosphingolipid. So again, here's our here's our sphingosine. And so here's our sphingosine backbone here. And here's a fatty acid on one side. And then we also now, though, have a carbohydrate attached over here. If this carbohydrate is a monosaccharide, then the molecule is what we call a cerebroside. Cerebrosides that are derived from the sugar D-galactose are found all over the place in our central nervous system. And so these are some of the different lipids and different protections that we might have in our nervous system. A cerebroside that is derived from D-glucose is found in most other tissues, and we'll see where some of those might show up in just a minute. And so all of that being said, all these different structures of lipids, one of the big things to remember, and one of the huge take-homes from lipids, is that there's this polar head, this water-loving head, and these non-polar tails that stream off from them. And so quite often we end up, especially membrane lipids, and so quite often we end up just depicting them like this and not really worrying, honestly, about what makes up the polar head and what makes up these non-polar tails. We just know that we have a big polar head on there and we have some non-polar tails streaming off from that. Which leads us to a structure like this, which probably looks somewhat familiar to you. If you remember back to your basic biology, here's a very typical cell membrane. And so these cell membranes are composed of this lipid bilayer, in which we have lipids here. Here's our polar head and our non-polar tails. Then the other side of it, our polar head and our non-polar tails. And so most of these are glycerophospholipids and sphingolipids that are making up this membrane here. And we have some other structural molecules in there, such as cholesterol, which we'll see in just a little bit. We have some proteins that span the length of the membrane, and we'll look at proteins in our next lecture. Carbohydrates that will often be in chains hanging off here. Remember when we looked at blood types? If this were a red blood cell, then remember that some of these carbohydrate chains and what are coming off them determine what type blood that we have. And so we're starting to put a lot of this together now and really look at how all this is coming together. The lipid bilayer is going to determine what can pass through it. And so when we talked about diffusion and osmosis earlier in the semester, very small non-polar molecules can pass through the lipid bilayer through diffusion. Water can pass through by osmosis. Some of those proteins that we saw spanning the bilayer, Some of those are transport proteins, which help ions get from one side of the lipid bilayer to another. So remember, one of the whole ideas of a cell membrane is that it is selectively permeable. It'll allow some things in and not others. And so this is how some of that gets regulated. The fact that cell membrane is made up of a lipid bilayer with polar heads and nonpolar tails is what allows some of these properties to occur, what gives rise to these properties, allowing things like the small nonpolar molecules to pass through and for water to pass through. But most ions can't. And so we have those transport proteins in there to help get ions across. Different hormones help regulate some of this transport as well. And the permeability and what can pass through depends on the saturation, depends on the concentrations. Remember when we looked at our differences between hyper and hypotonic and isotonic? That will play a role in what can pass through our cell membranes as well. This now brings us to the last type of lipid to talk about, which are things like cholesterol, steroids, and lipoproteins. Steroid is a term that really has a pretty negative connotation in everyday language. People hear steroids and they think, oh, pumping up, he's on the roids. That type of growth, muscle growth steroid is just one type of steroids. Steroids in general are just a class of molecule. And they're a class of molecule that have this very characteristic ring system. Now, they're, of course, you can see here, very, very structurally different from the lipids that we've talked about so far. They still fall into a class of lipids, though, because they're only soluble in organic solvents. And that's one of the hallmarks of lipids. Cholesterol is a precursor to different steroid hormones, also to vitamin D, and different bile salts that make up some of our digestive system. And we can see here's cholesterol here. And so that's what a molecule of cholesterol looks like. And so we can add to this or change the structure a little bit in order to get some of these other molecules. Bile salts, as I mentioned, are part of our digestive system. They're emulsifying agents which are produced in the liver, and they get stored in the gallbladder, and they help break up some of our dietary fats. Steroid hormones end up being synthesized from cholesterol. Glucocorticoids, a type of steroid hormone, are produced by the adrenal cortex, which is the outer part of the adrenal gland that rests above the kidney. These types of hormones regulate glucose metabolism, which is going to be a huge part of our topic in our last lecture, actually. They also have anti-inflammatory and immunosuppressant features. These types of molecules can therefore be used to treat autoimmune conditions as well as allergies and asthma. Cortisol, hydrocortisone, is a molecule that's released in response to stress, causes an increase in our blood glucose, and also facilitates fat and protein metabolism. Prednisone is another related compound to that. So again, we can see, so these are all different types of steroids, just different in various ways in their structure, but they're all sort of derived from that cholesterol molecule. Mineral corticoids regulate electrolyte balance in our tissues. Aldosterone increases blood pressure. Sex hormones, progesterone, estrogen, androgens, testosterone, they control development and sexual characteristics in the fetus and puberty. All different types of steroids. Cholesterol and triglycerides are transported by what we call lipoproteins. Lipoproteins assemble as this spherically shaped monolayer of lipids. So instead of a lipid bilayer, it's just a lipid monolayer. So we can see that here. And then triglycerides and cholesterol are transported in the core here. And so if our body needs to move some triglycerides or cholesterol around, then it gets moved around in this phospholipid monolayer shell. We differentiate lipoproteins by their density. The greater the lipid content, the less dense the lipoprotein. And various types of lipoproteins differ in their functions. And so if you've ever had blood tests done to look at your cholesterol, low density lipid proteins, LDL, that's what's typically known as bad cholesterol, versus your HDL level, high density lipoproteins, those are what is known as your good cholesterol, so to speak. Yep, and actually I was trying to remember if I wanted to talk about that, and I really didn't. And so again, I know this is a big information dump, which is pretty much what these biomolecule lectures are all about, is just getting some of this other information out there so you have a familiarity with these types of compounds and these types of molecules and some of their roles in the body and in health and in what they do. And so that is all for our lipid lecture. Stay tuned next time when we will start talking about proteins. I'll see you then.